few months ago, I went outside to check the mail. I have one of those really old mailboxes that's right outside of my house. I decided to look through it, and it was filled with nothing more than bills, flyers, and various magazines of sorts that I'd subscribed to. As I was digging through it, I noticed something else at the bottom of that mailbox. It was a videotape. Now, sometimes I tend to find things in the mailbox, like bugs, garbage, and various things like that. Hell, a few years back, we had found a squirrel that had made a nest there. But the question was, why was there a videotape there? I picked it out of it, and I looked at it. I mean, it looked like a normal videotape. I decided to inspect it a little bit more, and I looked at the side. There was a shiny sticker of a butterfly on it. I peeked into the mailbox, hoping to find some kind of explanation for the videotapes, but I could find nothing else. I walked inside and set up my VCR, which had been collecting dust by then. I inserted the tape and waited until it was completely finished rewinding, and when it finally finished, I pressed play on my remote. Now, I think I should probably might add that it was rather late at night. Not really sure why I didn't check the mailbox earlier that day, but I guess it was probably because of the fact that I was pretty lazy. Given the fact that I didn't really have too much to do and I didn't have to go to work the next day, I decided to grab a little bit of popcorn from the pantry and a soda and plop my ass down on the couch. I was ready to watch whatever the hell was on this thing, and of course, if it was something stupid, then, well, at least I wasted a little bit of time. The video started with one of those WNED indents. I had last seen that indent when I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, respectively. What followed was an old advert for marine land from the 1990s. During that advert, various parts of the screen began flashing. I couldn't exactly make out what exactly was flashing because it only lasted for about a quarter of the second. The marine land ad was cut off and it went to black. I was about to rewind to see what the hell it was that was flashing on there when a familiar thing came up. It was PBS Kids. There was a brief advert for Chuck E. Cheese's, and I smiled as I watched my childhood return to me. Suddenly, it faded to what the show was coming up next. Coming up next, Dragon Tales on PBS Kids. I'm sure that most of you know about the show Dragon Tales. It's better that you've seen at least 5 episodes of the show before you understand any of this. The intro of the show finally started up. Everything was normal except for the fact that there really wasn't a whole lot of sound in it. I mean, sure, the sound technically was there, but parts of it seemed to be cut off at points, very likely because of the tape's condition. However, as it got to the middle of the intro, it cut off, and then immediately cut back to a picture of Max sitting on a yellow chair with the words Dragon Tales, with a Z at the end, crudely written above him in red. The thing that weirded me out most was Max's facial expressions. He looked pale and his eyes were a little bloodshot. He sat there as if he was trying to get himself to smile, but his face read otherwise, almost like if he needed to cry. The episode then officially started after the title card cut out. It showed the outside view of Max and Emmy's house as it always does. The sky was a simple dark and red and orange-like color, like the mid-evening. Max walked in holding his elbow. "Ow!" he exclaimed. "I bumped my elbow on the table." Emmy looked at him. She had a frown on her face. "Well, maybe if you'd fuck me, then your elbow wouldn't hurt so much, you stupid idiot," she replied as laughter began playing in the background. I was dumbfounded at what I just heard. Did she say what I thought she just said? More significantly, I might add, there weren't any credits or episode title. Then Max said, "Emmy, Mommy told us not to say that word." Emmy took a deep breath, but before she could speak, Max screamed, "Don't do it, Emmy!" he cried. I don't... I don't want to go through this again. Do what? I wondered. What was Emmy going to do? I was starting to get a little bit concerned at this point. I mean, I knew that I certainly wasn't watching an episode of Dragon Tales, but what the heck was I even watching? Was this some kind of edit? Was it some kind of fuck up or something? It didn't make a lot of sense to me. As I pondered this, they continued their conversation. The rest itself wasn't exactly audible, then again it might be because of the fact that I wasn't paying too much attention. But I finally managed to get my mind on track, and finally Emmy suggested in a simple, clear tone, why don't we go to Dragonland? The dragon wallpaper was a simple black and bright red, contrary to the simple pastel colors that it usually had. The dragons on the walls had smiles on their faces. Nothing too completely out of the ordinary, I mean, they looked pretty much the same. But my question was, why exactly were they colored that way? Perhaps maybe the tape? Who really knows? They immediately held each other's hand in hand and chanted, I wish with all my heart to fly with dragons in a land apart. Once they had arrived in Dragonland, they decided to start looking for their friends. It was then that they found Ord sitting behind a rock, with a portable radio sitting beside him. Max immediately approached him and tapped him on the shoulder. Hey Ord, you want to play with my new truck? He asked. Ord turned around. I could hear that the radio was playing something. At first, I couldn't hear what the voices were saying because the quality was not that great. But gradually over time, the quality itself improved, and I began to hear what the man on the radio was saying. This is what he said.
This is a terrible situation we have here. The police have confirmed the plane carrying President Clinton was hijacked by a few members of Al-Qaeda. The plane crashed into the Statue of Liberty in New York City, the city where Clinton was supposed to appear. We're not sure who else was in that plane or if there were any casualties. I don't know anything, but all I can tell you is that the Statue of Liberty is in flames and the plane carrying Clinton has been destroyed.
During the time the radio was playing, Ord was sitting behind the rock. He didn't have any expression on his face. He was just sitting there, still. He wasn't dead, at least not that I could tell, but his face almost certainly looked like it. I thought back to Max's expression on the chair. Once the static had finally cleared, Ord walked away. He walked expressionless, and he walked in a straight line around Dragonland. The sky itself was a simplistic evening sky. Ord then proceeded to give a simple smile. And then a scream erupted out of nowhere. It cut to a zoom in of a photorealistic image of Ord in a bony-like state lying dead, where his eyes were torn out and a message carved on his head. On it, it stated nothing but pure gibberish. It then cut back at that second, and then it faded into a church-like structure. The deep bell rang in a distorted, deep tone. The sky was still red. The anchorman proclaimed,
Breaking news. President Bill Clinton is dead. He was killed this afternoon in a plane crash along with Vice President Al Gore and 55 other government officials. Also on the plane was rock and roll legend Chuck Berry and 40 other people. The plane had been hijacked, and people's names have yet not been confirmed. This is terrible. A terrible, shocking day for not only the United States of America, but for the entire world. As you can see, we hear blood-curdling screams coming from this plane crash and call the police to investigate. However, all they found was a shattered television, a broken game console, and a torn-up couch. I claimed to have heard something that sounded like a knife stabbing through flesh and a smooth fall. Few even claimed to have heard gunshots. However, none of this has been confirmed to be true, as there's nobody there. There are no bullet shells, knives, or even blood for that matter. Apparently, there's the one last piece of evidence the officers missed in their original search. A pair of glasses. Given the distinguishing features of the glasses are unusually round. Other than that, they're just plain brown glasses with one lens broken. All the other officers couldn't remember seeing these glasses somewhere, but most of them couldn't recall where. One cleaner said they were on a TV show once. However, he couldn't seem to remember what the show was called. The only thing that he could remember was that the main character wore glasses similar to that. All we know now is that there's apparently emerged a monster loose, or a kidnapper, and the teenager who is dead or missing. Folks, that's all the recent information we've received. Tune in the next 10 minutes for further details.
After that, the radio static came back. It showed paintings of the inside of the church. At that moment, I assumed that it had something to do with the death of Clinton. It zoomed in on the coffin. Then Zach appeared on screen and shouted, "Cassie, no!" It cut to a third-person video. It was silent, except for random beeping noises. And by silent, all you could hear was a film projector running. It showed Cassie walking around in a white background. She just kept on walking. The beeping sounds got louder. Cassie stopped. She walked over towards the screen. I could hear her breathing. Her eyes were bloodshot, her teeth were broken, and her hair was shaved off. At this point, I thought Cassie could hear me. Cassie opened her mouth. What followed was the most ear-piercing, loudest sound I had ever heard in my life. It wasn't like a scream, but a really messed up beeping sound that was louder than any human could possibly hear. My ears sometimes still ring from that, and that's how bad it was. In fact, I'm lucky I'm not deaf from it. Cassie continued to stare at me. I didn't want to watch this shit anymore. I tried to shut the damn thing off. Said Cassie in the voice of a crying, choking woman. We must pray to Satan. And then it faded to black. It faded to the Dragon tune. For those of you who don't know, the format was 2 10-minute episodes and a song in between. I hoped that this nightmare had finally ended. It hadn't. The song was an organ track that was being looped repeatedly. The video quality also lowered in quality, so I couldn't see what was really going on. From what I could make out, there were about 500 dragons in a circle chanting, "Cassie, Cassie, Cassie," over and over again for about a minute. Cassie then smiles and jumps into the fire. The video quality suddenly improved. It showed Cassie's flesh burning. She looked at me and proclaimed, "You did this to me," before her skin was burnt to ashes and her entire body turned to rubble. It actually showed her being burnt all the way through. Suddenly, hundreds of dragons pounced on her remains. They began to scratch at each other. They were devouring each other. It showed dragons biting into each other's skulls, dragons ripping off the flesh of other dragons, and fleshless dragons crying blood. I began to wonder how in the name of Lucifer himself was this a dragon tune. The scene changed back to Max and Emmy back with their house. "I need my truck," exclaimed Max. "Well, hurry up," said Emmy in an angry voice. Max then fell into the toy box he was searching in. Emmy, help me! I'm locked in! Help, please!" Max screamed. He was crying. Really crying. Emmy screamed, "It's stuck!" You could feel the pain as Max panicked to try and get out. However, to make a long story short, he didn't. It cut to a giant cage. It showed Zach and Wheezy on all fours, drinking water from a dish. And they began to sing. The singing was muffled, so I couldn't understand the words. After a while, the song became more clear, and the voices of Zach and Wheezy now sounded like an old man with a gruff voice, and a little girl no more than 4. The last verse went something like this.
laudate tuum, quaniam ipsies diaboli, et imus postiate te delore, et cruciatur quia non possimus, omnes esse vitio, quaniam iliud manum timiete.
Then they paused. The video cut to a surveillance camera room. There was a girl and an old man in the room. In fact, it was the same two people who voiced Zack and Wheezy. The little girl was crying. "Stand up," the man said in a gruff voice. "I said stand the fuck up," the man shouted. You could feel her pain as she was forced and screamed at repeatedly. Her screams and cries echoed. Finally, the screams and cries stopped. "Stand up, you filthy piece of crap," the man yelled. She kept screaming. Out of the blue, a loud gunshot rang out as the man shot her. The girl continued to scream loudly. 5 shots were heard. You could hear the whispering of the old man's voice. "Oh shit, what am I gonna do with the body?" It cut to a bunch of stop-motion animation sequences of different angles of a plane crashing into the Statue of Liberty. I didn't understand how any of that had it connected together. It then cut to pitch black. Suddenly, a face came out of the shadows. It was a terrifying figure from one of the worst nightmares I had when I was 5. It looked like the devil. His eyes were bulging out and he had a big smile on his face. He opened his mouth and let out an ear-piercing sound I had heard earlier. I was able to stop the video now. I didn't want to see the face of that terrible thing anymore. I shut off the VCR and stayed up all night on my computer. I threw out the tape, but after I took some photos of the episode, for garbage day I made sure the video was in the garbage. However, I unfortunately found that it wasn't there. I searched the house and it was nowhere to be seen. I haven't seen the tape yet, and I don't think I ever will. And I warn all of you, I've given the description that I could give. If you find this damn thing, do me a favor. Burn the ever-living fuck out of it. Didn't exactly expect myself to actually choose something like this, especially given how poorly made this pasta was. But I guess something had to be done about this pathetic excuse of a creepypasta, am I right? With that said, the pasta definitely had, or I say had for a reason, the potential to actually be creepy, but of course, we don't get that now, do we? Instead, we've managed to get a pasta that's riddled with cliches, pointless plot lines, and lackluster storytelling. Oh, and the grammar as well. I'll be getting to that later. But let's get started with the actual startup, shall we?
Laudate tuum, quaniam ipsies diaboli, et imus postiate te delore, et cruciatur quia non possimus, omnes esse vitio, quaniam iliud manum timiete.
To put it as nicely as I possibly can, the story is a cliched mess of absolute trash. It is a major dumpster fire, but I think you all already know that by now. Given how I don't feel like going through every single cliche in the story, given the fact that I've already kind of talked about this kind of thing before, I'll just point out a few of the major quote-unquote highlights of the story. Cliche number 1, demon/devils. A completely unnecessary inclusion in the story. Honestly, it just made this pasta a lot stupider than it should have been. The quote, praying to Satan bit and sacrificing of Cassie, everybody eating each other, demonic chants, and everything else was just stupid. Stupid, pathetic, and provided no element of scares to any of this story. It didn't even it didn't even go into the plot line, if you can even say that there's a plot line with a story, which, let's be honest here, there really isn't. I mean, even if it wasn't included in the pasta, none of it would have been scary. I mean, think of it for a single second. There's the whole radio thing, there's this, there's that, there's all the characters completely acting out of the ordinary, which you all know is a major problem. Again, I'm gonna say it, if you're going to have characters act out of character, you need to sit there and make sure of it, that it fits. That it basically fits. Cliche number 2. The VHS tape showing up without any explanation, context, or reason. I've already sat there and I've ranted about this on the Max and Ruby 0004 pasta, but if you're going to have a random tape that shows up at your doorway or your mailbox, at the very least, at the end, explain why and how it got there at the beginning of the story or at the end. And don't give me that unreleased tape bullshit either. Come up with a valid explanation and include it in your story so that way the audience can at least get a better knowledge and know-how about how it even remotely came to be. It doesn't even have to sit there and go into too much detail, but an explanation would definitely help. One good example of this is the King of the Hell Lost episode. If you really want to sit there and use it as a potential good reference, use that. But for the love of God, don't rip it off. Cliche number 3. Pretty much everything else in this godforsaken pasta. I really just don't feel like including any more of this, because this entire story is nothing else more but a massive cliche fuck you up the ass repeatedly. Due to the fact that we're only given the fact that already with everything else that I've sat there and I've said in the story, we're included with another thing. Unnecessary shock for the sake of the inclusion of shock. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, I won't go into detail about what exactly it was. I will link the story, you can check it out for yourself, but seeing that and everything and seeing how it was just thrown in just for the sake of throwing in an unnecessary and ungodly amount of shock really just made me go, oh, are you freaking kidding me? I mean, don't get me wrong. Do I find it insulting? Well, maybe on a writer's perspective, yes, but on a moral level, not really. I mean, to be frank with all of you, it's a fictional story, and while I will admit that it dealt with the subject matter way too poorly and just threw it in just for the sake of throwing it in there, there's really just no reason to just go up in arms on the author in any way, shape, or form. I mean, again, it's bad, it's stupid, and you want to know how bad the inclusion of the shock value in the story was? This story managed to make Clockwork Your Time Is Up, that little element of shock that was thrown in, actually work, compared to this god-awful pile of absolute horse feces. Still, it's just, everything else in the story is just pure unadulterated trash. I mean, what else more is there to say? The demonic chanting was already something I already covered, the blood, the gore, the eating all the dragons, and, just everything just being wrong. The blood red skies, the, church, the demonic bells, everything else is just, it's wrong. The characters swearing also being one of those main things that just completely and utterly just tore the story down. Just tore it down and just was complete and utter shit. That's all I can say. This story is shit. But we're going to get into one more thing. I'm not even going to separate this, because it doesn't need to be. And that's the grammar. I will admit that the grammar wasn't too terrible compared to most other pastas. Most other Lost episode pastas I've seen. However, there were parts of the story that seriously needed a separation. I can't tell you how many times I've sat there and I've read the story, or I've tried to read the story, and it was, and I quote, "A few months ago, I went outside to check the mail. I have one of those really old mailboxes that's right outside of my house, period. I looked through the mail, period. It was all bills, flyers, magazines, period. Then I noticed something else at the bottom of the mailbox, period. It was a videotape." Do you not see the problems with that? Number one, there doesn't need to be that many periods. Obviously, yes, there needs to be separations in order to make sure that there isn't run-on sentences. That's the one thing I can at least give the story, is that it doesn't have run-on sentences. But this here is just completely unnecessary. If you really wanted to make this work, this is how exactly you would put it out. Instead of what I've just stated, I'd basically write it in this way. I have one of those really old mailboxes that's right outside of my house. And, of course, while I looked through my mail, there was nothing else more but just simply bills, flyers, and various magazines of various sizes and shapes that I had ordered from various subscription places. And then I noticed something else at the bottom of the mailbox that completely stood out to me. It was a videotape that I didn't remember seeing there firsthand. I know that right there was still kind of cliched, but at the very least, it actually flows better. I mean, it's a problem. Now, sure enough, it isn't always the case with the story. It definitely improves a little bit more gradually as the story continues on. But still, it's something that I genuinely believe needs to be polished up a little bit. I mean, just take it, put it through Google Docs, and just kind of fix that up. That's all you really gotta do. And of course, if you manage to do that, the grammar in the story would actually be good. Maybe not completely perfect, or maybe even perfect if you really go out of your way and put some time and effort into it. But still, definitely needs to be polished up a little bit more, and the grammar and everything else will be perfectly fine.
Laudate tum, quaniam ipsi est diaboli, et imus postiet te dolore, e cruciatur quia non possimus, omnes esse video, quaniam iliud ludiud, manum tibiete.
In fear and surprise, as your eyes widen, your mouth goes dry with each battered breath. You try to scream, your mind begs to leave, glued to your computer screen. The killers they slash, the tapes burn and crash. The cartridge you bought will be your final haunt. The rituals of hate will seal your fate. The tears you shed will be from the fear-gripping horror-driven nightmarish gore-filled, terrorizing, hateful, burning, violent, rage-inducing, knife-slashing, blood-splattering, silent screams. Only time will tell if you will escape this online hell. Your horror-filled obsessions will come with its own regressions. Your pathetic screams will not be heeded in any way, because your nightmares will come at